This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program Living Legends collection. This interview was originally conducted in 1973. No day or month is given. That part of the introduction was obliterated on the master tape. The interview is conducted by Mr. Frank Benedy. The interviewee is Mr. Emmett Ray of Hitchcock, Oklahoma. This interview is being re-recorded on the 17th of September 1984 for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
(1973) recording for Oklahoma Northwest. I'm interviewing Emmett Ray of Hitchcock, Oklahoma, Blaine County. Emmett, where were you born?
Born in Canadian County near the little town of Piedmont.
How did your father happen to be there, and about what year?
I was born in 1897, and father married a girl that lived in that area, and they were living at the time of my birth.
And where was your father from originally?
Well, he was originally from Texas.
Do you know which part of Texas?
Around Jacksboro, Texas.
That is east of Dallas, isn't it?
Western Dallas.
West of Dallas.
Yeah.
And what did your father do before he came to Oklahoma?
Oh, he was just a young man that lived there on the farm till he was about 16, and then he took off to the western part of Texas, up by the old XIT ranch, worked there for some time, then went on into the country up in Montana and spent a lot of time there till he came back into Piedmont. He also made the run into Oklahoma City at the opening of the country.
In 1889?
Yeah.
Did he take up a farm?
He took a lot in Oklahoma City, but he said when everything was straightened out and they cleared up where the lot was, there was two other fellows on the back end of it, and he was overpowered, so he didn't get him.
Your father, you say, must have been a cowboy, in other words.
Yeah, he was quite a cowboy and did a lot of bronc riding in his earlier days. Before the time of the rodeo, however, but he just did it for the entertainment of the crowd, just baseball games around.
Did he drive cattle down the
Yeah, he drove cattle.
trails?
He drove cattle from West Texas up to the railroads in northern up into Kansas. Made that drive.
Did he tell you much about that?
Oh, well, not too much about the drives. He talked a little bit about his experience and his work on the ranch and up in Wyoming, but he didn't ever elaborate too much on the ranching or the drive part of it.
About how large was your dad?
Well, he was about 5'9" and weigh about 150 pounds, I guess.
And he always liked cattle, if I remember.
Yes, he was quite a hand. We had cattle all our lives. From the time I was big enough to know what one looked like, we was fooling with cattle.
Now, when he left Piedmont, where did he go?
He came to the farm out here west of Hitchcock, 5 miles west of Hitchcock, in the Chip Hills out there, as we call them.
Could you tell some of his early experiences out there?
Well, he had owned a thrashing machine down in Canadian County and used to do quite a bit of thrashing. And he traded this thrashing machine for 160 acres of land as his first holdings out here in Western.
He had quite a lot of land in those days.
He'd accumulated, when he was killed in 1921, he'd accumulated about 1,800 acres of that hill land out there.
That was a lot of land in those days. He must have been a pretty good manager.
Well, I don't know. He seemed to do pretty well. Of course, he made most of his money in cattle in the early days. We didn't farm any at all for years, just raise, feed, and cattle. That's all we had.
How did he market his cattle?
Well, they were brought in here to the town of Hitchcock and shipped in carload lots to Oklahoma City. If he shipped himself, done his own shipping. Most of the cattle was sold to some of the local buyers around at various times over the country who did ship them. That was the only way they had to get them to market them days, was on the railroads.
Now, I've been told your mother was a good writer.
Well, I wouldn't say she was any hand to ride a bronc or anything, but her and him did lots of riding. They did lots of riding.
They enjoyed
the riding in the hills, yeah. She'd go out with him on the pastures up there and help round up the cattle.
And you say your father was killed, could you?
He was killed while he was in Wyoming on an elk hunt, and we don't know any of the details, only that he was hurt on a horse. That's all we know. We never could get anything else out of it.
Did he go with somebody around here?
Carl Schuber here at Hitchcock was with him. And Carl, at the time that he was injured, wasn't with him. So we don't know just exactly what happened. We never have found out.
Did he get to the hospital? Or?
Yeah, they took him to the hospital at Rock Springs, Wyoming. And we received a telegram from the hospital that he was in the hospital and was injured. And Mother and her brother, or his brother, took the train the next day to go out there. But he had passed away before they got there.
And how old were you at that time?
I was, I'd have been about 21 years old at the time. About 21.
And did you then take care of the farm?
Yeah, me and the rest of the other two boys, we took the farming over, and he left us plenty of equipment to work with and all that kind of stuff, so we just went ahead and operated, just the same as it had been.
What did the hills look like in those days?
Well, in the early days here, these hills were, they were, the grass growing all over the side of these mountains out here was just unbelievable. And an amazing thing that the old-timers thought that you had to burn all the grass off every spring so it would turn green quick. And as the overgrazing and the burning of the grass, and it began to erode, and by the early 20s, it had eroded some of those hills down, and during the 30s, the drought section, it really finished this erosion of these hills out. But they have been properly handled lately, and they're back in pretty productive pasture again.
You have owned quite a lot of land out there, don't you?
Well, we've got about 800 acres out there left yet, myself, and the other children have, altogether we've got about 3,000 or 4,000 acres out there in the hills.
And it has oil under it, I believe, doesn't it?
Well, gas, yeah.
About what do those wells produce in gas? About how many cubic feet? Just...
roughly, depending, some of them produce 1 million, and some of them a day, and some of them produce 2 or 3 million. It just varies.
Now, what do you consider a good well?
Well, the people that drill them, and they're the ones that would say, if they can get 1 million cubic feet a day, that it'll be a paying well.
Uh-huh. Now, you started farming right in the Depression and accumulating this land.
I started farming in 1923. That is before the Depression. And I bought my first land in 1923.
Who was selling land in those days?
Well, just local people around here, just like it is nowadays. There was no one in particular that was in that business. I purchased my first piece of land from Henry Fleming, who had these farms here by town and run the old furniture store here.
Were most of the farms 160 acres, or were they a little larger out there?
Oh, the average farm in the country we were in would run quite a bit over that. However, down in this part of the country at that time, there was a lot of 160-acre farms. A few of them had accumulated more than that, but I think here we made an average study here one time in the county, and the average size farm was a little over 400 acres. This was in the late 20s when we made this survey.
Did you like to farm wheat better, or did you like cattle better?
Well, you almost have to have both of them if you're going to do any good. Your winter pasture, your wheat, it's almost it's a combination that you can't. I don't think you can work one without the other hardly.
What do you think was the biggest problem in raising cattle and wheat in your country?
Well, of course, drought has been the biggest problem in raising anything in these countries here for years. And when we don't have the drought, well, we do pretty well. But the drought has hurt more farmers and more people here than the one thing, I think, in this country.
Have you enjoyed living in this country?
Well, it's the best I ever lived, you know. I've done a lot of thinking along that line, and since I've became up in years, I've done a lot of other things. And if I had it to do over again, knowing what I know now, I don't believe I'd go to farm. I believe I could find something that'd be easier.
You did farm some in eastern Oklahoma, didn't you?
Well, we owned land down there. I never did do anything but operate the cattle part of it. I had some land down southeast Oklahoma, about 30 miles southeast of Ada, which was very productive, good pasture land, but it wasn't a farming country. They never grew anything but a few oats and used to grow cotton, but the boll weevil beat them out of that.
What's the biggest difference between farming down there and farming here?
Well, the big difference would be in the size of the farm you'd have. Down there, you don't have large enough areas as an average. I'm talking about your timbered land and hills. You can't get as big a farmland together as you can out in the wheat belt here. And they don't even grow wheat at all right there at this portion where I was. There was no wheat growing at all.
I think you kind of like wheat and cattle.
Well, I know I do. They've been awful good to me.
Now you were out here in the early days, and you probably heard some of these old stories. Do you remember one that you think I ought to ask you?
Well, there's been so many of them that I just don't know hardly which one to start out on. I know that if I was smart enough, I could start and write a history of the life here in the early days. It'll be a good seller, but I'm not that smart, so I won't do that. But the neighbors were altogether different than they are nowadays. You was always either at someone's place for a Sunday dinner, or they were at your house. They'd load up in a wagon and move out, travel 5 or 6 miles across country, and have a big feed. Everybody'd have a good time, and seemed as though we had a lot of old-time fiddlers, and we'd have plenty of music and a lot of dances on Saturday nights. Seems like nobody has time to visit with his neighbors anymore.
What neighbor that stands out in your mind?
Oh, we had the Robertson family that lived just about 3/4 of a mile from us. Their children are all about our age. We grew up together. And there was a Fred Stuck family and the Wrights, and there was quite a bunch of them in there around us. And another family we visited a lot with was the Elsie Perkins family that lived up just south of where the present plant at Southard is now.
Now, where did you go to school when you moved here to Hitchcock?
We walked 2.5 miles to the little country school of Centralia, and I want to make one comment on that we went, the first years we went to school, and the first few years we went to one of the first integrated schools that there was. They had the mixed classes there, both colored and white race, which after a few years they started the segregated schools, but our first years we were not desegregated.
Did you have any Indian children?
Yes, there was few Indians too. Few Indians, not many, but a few.
And you live not too far from Romanos, I believe.
Well, we were raised about 2.5 miles north of Romanos Park, and that ground in the spring around there was one of our chief hunting and trapping grounds when we was kids. That's where we went and caught our furs to get our spending money in the winter.
Now, Centralia, what type of school was it? What building? What kind of a building?
Well, the original building there was an old log picket that was made of logs driven in the ground, and that was the original school, but I never attended that. It had been torn down a year or two, and we had a one-room school. And it'd be during the early part of the fall, before the crops were harvested, we'd have an average of about 35 or 40 in attendance. But during the winter months, when the most of the work was done, we'd get as high as 55 and 60 students in that little one-room building. Have 8 classes and 1 teacher, so you can imagine what kind of a condition of school under.
What, do you remember your teacher's name?
Yes, Tina Ray was one of them. Now, they're no relation to me. And then Annie B. Reddick was another one, and I can't remember any of the others right now, but then those 2, I can remember those. Then we had a man by the name of Goldsmith. He taught 1 year. I remember that, too.
Now, whatever you'd finish a year of school, did you have to pass a test to?
No, we never had anything there, only just graduated through the class. But to get from the 8th grade into high school, you was required to go to the county and take a county examination. It was given at the county superintendent's office. And at the time, in the early part of this, that was all that was required to become a teacher, was an 8th grade certificate. You could go out and become a school teacher with
If you passed
the 8th grade
grade.
certificate. You could be entitled to go teach country schools.
Now, about what percentage of these students would pass that test?
Well, there was very few of them that ever went that long in the early part of the history up there. And I don't remember who might have been one of the first ones, but it seems as though there was a Blythe Burnham that was one of the first ones that ever graduated or taken the examination and passed up there. But later on, before they shut the school down, well, practically all of them were completing their education. 8th grade there and going into high school.
Now, you say there were colored children. Where did most of these colored people live?
They lived on the river west of here, along out there, and there were cotton farmers out there on the river, west of on the Canadian River. There was very few in the area around Hitchcock. We had a segregated school about 4 miles east out here, and they did attend a separate school down in this district. I attended high school here and graduated from high school here at Hitchcock.
Do you remember the town of Ferguson?
Very well, yes. The big old salt plant that was there, and it was quite a point in connection with Hitchcock, because the morning train came up to Bigford. The salesman would come over to Ferguson, get off, and they would be met by a livery team out of the stable and brought over here to Hitchcock, and they would work the merchants here and sell their goods all day, and then they'd go back in the evening and catch the 7 o'clock train back to Oklahoma City.
That was a Choctaw Oriental Railroad?
Well, there's a Choctaw, Rock Island, and Pacific.
Oh.
Originally the Choctaw. It was originally just Choctaw Railroad, and then the Rock Island was the one that's built here. But the Rock Island finally bought the Choctaw out, which made them the same, one of the same system in later years.
Now, Hitchcock had the Rock Island. How come they didn't take the... I noticed that most people who come from Oklahoma City came to Ferguson. Why was that?
Well, you had a direct line from Ferguson to El Reno and into the city, and the one that went through Hitchcock went south through Geary down to Waurika. It never went towards, it didn't travel towards the city. It went from Waurika to Enid.
Now, where was Darrow?
Darrow was northeast or northwest, well, almost straight north of here, about roughly 10 miles.
Now, why do you suppose Darrow was built?
Well, Darrow was like all the rest of these little communities. They started small stores, trading points in all the areas. Then it's on the crossroad of the Frisco and the Choctaw Railroad originally here, and it had a little motel, or hotel rather, and some stores there and a lumber yard. It was a very nice, thriving little city in its early days.
Now, which railroad went on to Homestead?
Choctaw went from there right on through Homestead to Fairview, or to Rusk. It missed Fairview, and then on to Alva, wound up at Alva. The other one...
Now, where did these tracks divide at?
They did divide in Geary. There were 2 separate roads. Then when the Rock Island bought them out, they come just south of Watonga down there, what they call the Greenfield Junction. and that's where they separated. And one went to Alvin, one to Old Keene. In later years, they taken the Choctaw up as far as Homestead, and then they go right across to Homestead, then went to Alva.
Now, Homestead doesn't have a railroad now, huh?
It has a spur over there from Old Keene that runs over and picks up the grain, the elevators.
Now, did it have, in early days, did it have a, when this Choctaw took off toward Rust or Fairview, did it have another line into Old Keene?
No.
It didn't.
No, that's the only two. They went one went right straight on through. There was no line between Homestead and Old Keene in the early days here. 1926 or 7 when they put that little junction across up there.
What do you remember about Ferguson besides the salt plant?
Well, it was a town of mostly it was completely supposed to be a complete colored settlement, and it was quite a area for saloons in the early days, as all these little towns were. They all carried their share of saloons. But Ferguson was almost a complete colored town outside of the employees at the salt plant in the early days here.
Now, did they have a school?
No, not that I know of. If they ever had a school there, I don't remember. Now, there was a school, colored school, just west of Ferguson, a half a mile in that settlement. But if Ferguson ever had a school itself, I don't recall it. It was out of existence before I knew the town, if there was ever one there.
Now, they said, I think I heard that Ferguson had or west of Ferguson was a colored church.
Yeah, oh yes, they had a colored church and school out there, yeah. I've attended several of their revival meetings there in the colored church.
Did they have colored preachers?
Oh yes, they had colored preachers.
You don't remember any of them's names?
Sister Bohannon was one of them. Barnwell and Bohannon they were raised out there, and they'd come back in there and hold revivals.
But, did they have good attendance?
Well, those little schools were pretty well full. They just held it in a little church and schoolhouse, but they pretty well filled it up.
Do you, and I believe it was 1908 that the Alf Hunter shot the Oklahoma County Sheriff east of Hitchcock?
1907 or 8, one in there. I recall the incident being very big enough, but Dad kept up pretty well track with it. And in fact, he was some of the posse that went out to help hunt him that day after the shooting, but they never did find him.
Do you remember, one day I was talking to you and you was telling me that a colored man told you a story about that. Jim Rouse, I believe you said.
Well, of course, there's been so many stories told about that incident that I wouldn't want to repeat any of them because I don't know whether they're true or not, but I know of one incident that happened
Do
here.
you know the name of the sheriff?
Garrison was one of them.
Was the one that got shot and killed?
Mm-hmm.
And he was from Oklahoma County?
Oklahoma City County, Oklahoma County, yeah. They reported at one time here right after the shooting that there was a colored fellow going west on a horse, and they thought it was Alf Hunter, and Dad and a bunch of the men here from town took out after him and caught him about 4 miles west out here, and they recognized him before they went up onto him, but there might have been some shooting going on if they hadn't recognized who he was, but he was a local colored man. He didn't, wasn't the right one.
I mean, he was pretty tickled, he wasn't.
I don't mind he was very tickled.
Now, do you know how the sheriff and how they got to Hitchcock and that?
Well, I suppose there was rumors were that they had tied their team in buggies out at the west of town here, or east of town here, where the shooting occurred, and that when they shot this one officer, the others got in the buggy and come into town and reported it to the authorities.
The Blaine County.
Yeah. Well, Blaine County Sheriff was with them out there when they done this shooting. So I don't know who they reported it to, but they said they come in town to report it.
The deputy was shot too, is that right?
Well, I've heard that he had a slight wound of some kind. I don't know how true that was, but I do know that this one was killed.
And after he was killed, did they say what happened next?
Well, they all left out there where the shooting occurred and came back into town, and they organized a posse to go back to hunt him while he was gone, and they never did find him out in the area at all. He'd left the straw stack in the wheat field where he did the shooting, and there wasn't anybody there.
Now, did he come on the train to Hitchcock?
Well, he came originally, the rumors are that he came to Ferguson and then come across country here. He come out of Oklahoma City that morning, rode the train into Ferguson.
What did Hitchcock look like the first time you saw it?
Well, Hitchcock was several buildings here. And there must have been a 500 or 600 population, but it was completely wooden buildings. No structures really of any kind except wood structures. And there was a bank, and there was several grocery stores, and 2 hardware stores. It was a very thriving city. It had a motion picture theater and butcher shops and everything. It was one of the best wheat marketing centers in this part of the country in the early days here.
Which part of the town was settled first?
Well, it was all settled at the same time. The Hitchcock town site was formed, which included all the land west of the railroad and the west edge of town. It was all settled. And when I remembered it first, it was a far bigger and more populous town than it is now. We used to have a theater here, and they'd have to run 3 shows to take care of the crowd on Saturday morning. They'd run the show 3 different times. We could get to see all of it.
Was Ferguson go in there?
No, Ferguson at that time had already very little of anything, or no store of any kind at that time.
Did you go to school here at Hitchcock?
I graduated here, 4 years high school here.
Was you one of the first classes that graduated?
No, Winnie McWilliams was the first one to graduate here. Graduated in 1917. The first graduate of Hitchcock. And then the following year, there was 2, I think, that graduated. And I was 11 in it when I graduated.
Who was the city marshal in early days?
Well, there were a lot of city marshals here. Remember John Stiles was here at one time, and an incident where he sold 3 head of calves, or cows, heifers, weighing about 700 pounds to the butcher at Watonga, and the 3 of them started to Watonga with their horses, driving these 3, and they got separated in the hills down by the old Bigford Mill, and when the smoke had all cleared away, and each one of them took after one of them, and when Dad finally got his to town, to Watonga, and put it in the slaughter pen, and one of the others lost his completely, never could find it, and the other one finally got a rope on his and tied it up, and when he come back and they all got together, they went back to where he had this one tied up, and he'd run it till it got so hot that it was dead when they got there. So they went to Watonga then, or went into Watonga, the butcher, he was with them, and he reported back that the one that they put in the crowd was dead, so they didn't get any of those to market.
How did you get to Watonga in those days?
Well, we just took cross country. There was very few roads, and had some trails, and we had to either drive a wagon or buggy, the only way we had of traveling those days. There was no graded roads in the country at that time.
Now, do you remember the Ruby plaster mill?
Oh yes, yes, I've been to the old Ruby plaster mill. It wasn't but a few years after we came here in 1902 until it was gone. It quit operating, but I was there when it was operating at one time.
If you came here in 1902, was the railroad already here?
Yes, railroads were
Both
here.
railroads?
Both railroads, yes.
And do you remember anyone saying just when they came through?
Offhand, I can't tell you. They hadn't been there very long, but then 1902 was when we came, and they were here then.
Now, was the Ruby mill as large as the Bickford mill?
No, the Ruby mill was a very small mill. It only had one kettle, and it was a very small operation. The plaster had to be hauled out to the railroad at Ferguson, which is about 4 miles by teams after it's made. They hauled it out. There was no other way of shipping it out. They just loaded on a wagon and hauled it in there and ship it out.
Well, you say it was about 4 miles from Ferguson?
4 miles straight west of Ferguson.
Straight west?
Mm-hmm.
My goodness. There's no road up that way now, is there?
Well, there's a road. Since we put these gas wells in there, we can drive a car right up to where it was now.
You can?
Yeah, we could last summer. I guess we can yet. See, they drilled a gas well right up there by the old mill, and they had to make a pretty fair road to get up there.
Was the well a good one?
No, it was dry. It didn't make a well at all.
Who owns that land up in there now?
Well, Beerson, the same fellow that owns the big ranch out here. Beerson from Okmulgee owns the land with the old mill.
Did the Ruby mill, you say, didn't operate too long after 1902?
It couldn't have been very much because it was shut down, I don't know just when, but it didn't operate very long after that. It was a very short time afterwards.
How long did Bickford operate?
Well, it started, I think, in 1907 and operated till 1911.
It didn't last very long
either.
either.
It didn't go very long. U.S. Gypsum Company at Southard kind of took the mining of the gypsum here over, and there was mills, two in Watonga and one in Old Keene, and several of them around, but they soon shut down.
You say they had a plaster mill in Old Keene?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Had one up here at Prim now where this other Fulton Gypsum Company is. There was one there, too.
What, would they just, you mean there was a plaster mill there?
Plaster mill there. Same time Southern was in there. They were at the same time.
The one at Old Keene, I guess they hauled their...
Yeah, it was shipped in on the tracks, loaded and shipped in on the train. Same way with the one at Watonga. This quarry down here, south of town, where Atlas operates, is where Watonga got their rock from.
About where was the road that you went on from Watonga?
Well, the main road would go west by the old schoolhouse up there, and then come in.
Centralia?
Centralia, and then come in on the same route that the blacktop now runs between Southern and Watonga. That road was from the schoolhouse on in. Then we had a road that came down to the hills and went up by Bigford and right up through the Romanos Park. That was just for horsebackers, or not much of a. It wasn't just a trail. All it was. There wasn't any road to it. Only just a trail that you get over.
Was this road 2 miles? Let's see, it'd be a mile west from the west edge of Hitchcock. Was it ever open through the hills?
Yes, the first road that went to Watonga, one of the first, was go a mile west and then south and right up over the top of the hills there. Mile west, or half a mile west of town here, one day when I was had walked into town to get some groceries, that's where I saw my first automobile. I saw it coming from the south, and then it turned past me. It was quite a thrill when I saw that first car.
You don't remember the name of it?
I imagine it was a brush. That was the main thing at that time, was a little 2-cylinder brush car.
Did the early cars have any trouble making these hills west?
Oh, well, they wasn't. They just didn't go over the hills then at all. That just didn't. Yeah, they would have had plenty of trouble making any kind of a hill. Almost It wasn't very more reliable. They're running on level ground than they were in the hills either. Most of them carried solid rubber tires. Didn't have any air in the tires, just carried a solid rubber.
Who did most of the thrashing west of Hitchcock?
Well, in the earlier part of the country, at the times, Frank Strock, who lived south of town, did as much out that way as anyone else. He had the machine. We started our thrashing outfit in 1916. That's west of town. We'd run a machine from then on up till we quit thrashing. But previous to that time, Earl Fouts and Frank Strock did most of the thrashing in this country, around down here in west.
What type of engine did they use?
They all used steam. At that time, they all used steam engines.
Did they have much trouble getting water out there?
They would have a lot of trouble with the water. Any water that's had minnows in it, hard water it's called, gyp would foam, and they couldn't hardly pull their separators. They had quite a time with water till they got up on the hill where they had the soft water. Of course, we couldn't, our drinking water was cistern water, and we sure couldn't furnish that out to run these threshers.
There weren't many ponds in those days, huh?
Very few, you know, they were very few. You built them with a horse and a two-horse team and a slip, and it didn't carry very much dirt. You might build a little one, but it wouldn't hold water very long.
Did you ever see any of your dad's relations?
Oh yes, I saw them. Knew all of them. They were down, scattered over the various parts of the state, but I visited and known all of his brothers and
Texas?
sisters. No, Oklahoma. They were all in Oklahoma for years. They're all dead now. None of them living anymore, but they lived here. Had one sister that went to Wyoming or to Idaho, and that's the only one what's lived right here in the state all their life.
And your dad had how many brothers?
Had two brothers.
What did they do?
Well, Uncle Charlie lived on a farm down there by Piedmont, and Uncle Ott, he was a groceryman and storeman at Fort Cobb. Lived there from 1904 on till he died here a couple of years ago. Lived there and got to be the Ford dealer and the banker and everything down there. He's lived his whole life there at Fort Cobb.
Your dad, did he ever go back to where he used to live in Texas?
Yeah, we were back there one time. It's been years and years ago, but he always talked about a big field that they had down there, and when we went back down there and drove up, found this place, and he looked at that field, and he said, I thought that was the biggest field in the world. There must have been 5 acres in it. Said it'd take us forever to plow that little 6-inch plow on one horse.
And your mother's folks?
They were all raised down here at Piedmont right there, and there's all of her brothers and sisters are dead, but cousins, I have a whole flock of cousins living down there at Piedmont now.
And your mother's folks, where did they come from before Piedmont?
Well, they were out of Texas, down at Gainesville, Texas. She was born in Gainesville, Texas. They all come out of Texas. Settled at Piedmont. At that time, Piedmont wasn't there. The little town of Matheson was the only post office out there, but later Piedmont was built at where they were at. California and everywhere else, but most of them are right here in the States yet.
Watergate. What do you think the deal is?
Well, I'll tell you, I've listened to a lot of their testimony and a lot of the things. Of course, the old story is that they're all doing it, which I think was right. But I think some of those parties involved in that, especially the ones that was caught in the break-in, after listening to their testimony, that they were actually sincere in what they were trying to do, and because they keep going back to Fidel Castro and what he did in Cuba and how he took that over, and I think they were actually, a lot of them fellows were really didn't want something like that to happen here. I think they were really sincere in what they done. Their main thought, they were all both hooked up with Cuba and Castro's time. They seen what happened there, and of course there was a lot of agitation in this country at this election about we should go over and as one man said, begged with tears to get our prisoners released, and that anybody that even thought about fighting this war was wrong about everything. And I think they become more alarmed than a lot of us did about the situation we was getting into.